The breaking news right now, a judge says there is probable cause to hold the Trump administration in contempt. This is in regards to the case of deporting Venezuelan migrants, despite that judge's order in his court to turn the plane around. CNN chief legal correspondent Paula Reed joins me now. Paula, what exactly is the judge saying?
Look, Dana, this is huge. We've been waiting for this opinion. Now, the judge here is still deciding punishment and the next steps. He is giving the Justice Department a chance to weigh in here. But this case, this question has, as you know, become a political flashpoint. President Trump has repeatedly attacked this judge, James Boasberg, even calling for him to be impeached. Now, much of this started last month. On March 15th, the president had invoked the Aliens Enemies Act to facilitate deportations of Venezuelan migrants. The government alleges were.
Okay, so we're witnessing what might be the most serious constitutional crisis of Trump's entire presidency. And it's happening right now as federal judges are taking the extraordinary step of reviving criminal contempt proceedings against Trump administration officials who deliberately defied court orders and continued mass deportations, even after judges explicitly told them to stop. This isn't some abstract legal dispute about policy differences or interpretation of statutes. This is federal judges finding probable cause that Trump officials willfully violated direct court orders, which is one of the most serious offenses you can commit in the American legal system, because it strikes at the very heart of whether courts have any power at all to check executive branch overreach. Judge James Boasberg, who's handling one of the key cases, made a finding back in April 2025 that there was probable cause to believe Trump administration officials engaged in criminal contempt by continuing to deport hundreds of Venezuelan migrants to El Salvador prisons, even after his court had issued injunctions specifically ordering them to halt those deportations and return the people who had already been sent. Now, in November 2025, after those contempt proceedings were temporarily blocked by an appeals court over the summer, they're being revived because the violations apparently never stopped, and judges are running out of patience with an administration that seems to believe it can just ignore court orders it doesn't like. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest. You can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us. Be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
A few minutes ago, are you hearing anything yet from Trump sources?
Not yet from the White House officially. They likely are waiting for the Department of Justice to respond. But look, this is something that the White House has made clear. The president has made it clear, certainly people who work around him, their view of Judge Boasberg, who we should point out was elevated by President Obama, but was initially appointed by George W. Bush. He's viewed as a straight shooter. He has a lot of conservative friends and allies as well, including some on the Supreme Court, his college roommates, etc. So, look, I think that this is the question here, it seems to be, and this is a 46-page ruling, as we just were looking through it.
The specific facts of what happened here are absolutely wild and really show you how far Trump's administration is willing to go in defying the rule of law. Trump invoked the Alien Enemies Act, which is this really old wartime statute that hasn't been used in decades, to justify mass deportations of Venezuelan nationals, claiming they represent a threat to national security. The problem is that the Alien Enemies Act has very specific requirements about when it can be used, and multiple federal judges looked at Trump's invocation of it and said, this doesn't meet the statutory requirements and you can't use this law the way you're trying to use it. So the judges issued injunctions ordering the Trump administration to stop these deportations while the legal challenges worked their way through the courts, which is completely standard procedure. When there's a serious legal question about whether the government has the authority to do something, courts issue temporary orders maintaining the status quo until they can fully resolve the issue. But instead of following those injunctions like every administration is supposed to do, Trump officials just kept deporting people, sending hundreds of Venezuelan migrants to prisons in El Salvador where conditions are reportedly horrific and where these people have no legal recourse or way to challenge their detention. Come on, think about how insane that is. Federal judges issue explicit orders saying, stop doing this thing because we need to determine if it's legal. And the executive branch just says, no thanks, we're going to keep doing it anyway. That's not how the constitutional system is supposed to work. The whole point of having three separate branches of government is that each one can check the power of the others. And when the judicial branch issues an order, the executive branch is supposed to follow it even if they disagree with it, and even if they plan to appeal it to higher courts. By just ignoring these court orders, Trump officials were essentially saying, we don't recognize the authority of federal judges to tell us what we can and can't do, which is exactly the kind of authoritarian thinking that the founders designed our system to prevent. When Judge Boasberg found probable cause for criminal contempt, he was saying there's sufficient evidence that these officials knew they were violating court orders and did it anyway, which, if proven, could result in fines and even imprisonment. That's how seriously the legal system takes contempt of court. It's not just a slap on the wrist, it's a crime that can land you in jail, because maintaining the authority of courts to have their orders followed is absolutely essential to having a functioning legal system. The appeals court drama around these contempt proceedings shows just how extraordinary and unprecedented this whole situation is. In August 2025, a three-judge panel on the appeals court voted 2-1 to temporarily block Judge Boasberg's contempt proceedings, with the majority calling it an extraordinary confrontation between branches of government. The two judges who voted to block the proceedings were both Trump appointees, which should tell you something about how much judicial philosophy and legal reasoning versus partisan loyalty factored into that decision. These judges argued that allowing criminal contempt proceedings against executive branch officials for how they carried out the president's orders would create too much conflict between the branches and would potentially hamper the executive branch's ability to function. But here's the thing. The dissenting judge on that panel and a growing chorus of legal experts have pointed out that this reasoning completely misses the point, because if executive branch officials can just ignore court orders whenever they claim they're following presidential directives, then the courts have no power at all, and we don't really have separation of powers anymore. We just have an imperial presidency that can do whatever it wants. The fact that these contempt proceedings are now being revived in November 2025 suggests that either the original appeals court panel has reconsidered, or that other courts are finding continuing violations that require judicial intervention. The broader pattern of federal judges from both parties pushing back against Trump's executive overreach is really significant, because it shows this isn't just partisan Democrats trying to obstruct Trump's agenda. We're seeing judges appointed by Trump himself, judges appointed by previous Republican presidents, and judges appointed by Democratic presidents, all independently reaching similar conclusions that the Trump administration is going too far and violating constitutional limits on executive power. The Guardian reported in October 2025 that a growing number of U.S. judges are actively rebuking what they're calling Trump's rogue presidency, with judicial pushback slowing down or blocking many of Trump's most extreme policy initiatives. This includes not just the deportation cases, but also challenges to Trump's use of emergency powers, his attempts to withhold congressionally appropriated funds, his efforts to purge the federal workforce, and numerous other actions where judges have found that Trump is exceeding his constitutional authority. When you've got this kind of broad-based judicial resistance cutting across ideological and partisan lines, that tells you the problem isn't biased judges. The problem is an administration that genuinely is operating outside legal and constitutional bounds. The national security justification that Trump is using for these deportations is particularly problematic because it's essentially claiming that the president can do whatever he wants as long as he invokes national security, and courts should just defer to his judgment without meaningful review. This is the same kind of reasoning that led to some of the worst abuses of presidential power in American history, from Japanese internment during World War II to warrantless surveillance programs after 9/11. The Alien Enemies Act that Trump is trying to use was passed in 1798 and was designed for situations where the United States is literally at war with another country and needs to detain or deport nationals of that enemy country. Venezuela is not at war with the United States. There's been no declaration of war by Congress, and the statutory requirements for invoking the Alien Enemies Act simply aren't met here. Judges have looked at this and said, you can't just declare a national security emergency and use that as a blank check to do things that would otherwise be illegal. And that's exactly the right legal conclusion, because otherwise every president could bypass all legal constraints just by saying the magic words national security. The connection to all the other scandals and legal problems plaguing Trump's administration makes this judicial confrontation even more significant, because it's happening at the same time as Trump is facing contempt threats for his personal courtroom behavior, mass DOJ prosecutor resignations over corrupt prosecutions, FBI Director Kash Patel being sued for illegal firings, Attorney General Pam Bondi losing court cases over unlawful actions, and House Speaker Mike Johnson openly defying Trump on border wall funding. When you look at all these issues together, what you see is an administration that's under siege from multiple directions, from its own career officials who are resigning in protest, from federal judges who are blocking its actions and threatening contempt charges, from Congress, where even Republicans are starting to push back, and from the political system more broadly, where voters are responding negatively to the chaos and lawlessness. The contempt proceedings against Trump officials for defying deportation orders fit perfectly into this broader narrative of an administration that views itself as above the law, and that's now facing consequences from a judicial system that's finally saying enough is enough. Let's dig into the specific legal mechanics of how these contempt proceedings work and why they represent such a serious threat to Trump administration officials who are named in them. Criminal contempt is different from civil contempt in important ways that matter for understanding what's at stake here. Civil contempt is typically used to compel someone to follow a court order going forward. The judge says you're in contempt, and you'll face escalating fines or other consequences until you comply with what I'm ordering you to do. Criminal contempt, on the other hand, is punishment for past violations of court orders, and it's treated as a crime that can result in fines and imprisonment. When Judge Boasberg found probable cause for criminal contempt against Trump officials, he was essentially saying there's enough evidence to believe these officials committed a crime by knowingly violating court orders, and now we need to proceed with something like a mini criminal trial to determine if they're actually guilty and what punishment should be imposed. The standard for finding someone in criminal contempt is quite high. Prosecutors or the judge have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the person knew about the court order, understood what it required, had the ability to comply with it, and willfully chose not to comply. The fact that Judge Boasberg found probable cause to move forward with these proceedings means he looked at the evidence and concluded that there's a reasonable basis to believe all of those elements could be proven. What's the evidence in this case? Well, we know that Trump administration officials were directly served with court orders enjoining the deportations. We know they acknowledged receiving those orders, and we know that deportation flights continued anyway, with hundreds of people being sent to El Salvador even after the court orders were issued. That's pretty much textbook willful violation of a court order. It's not like these officials can claim they didn't know about the injunction or that they tried to comply but somehow failed through no fault of their own. They made a deliberate decision to keep doing what they were doing despite the court telling them to stop. The individuals who are potentially facing contempt charges include high-level officials at the Department of Homeland Security and Immigration and Customs Enforcement who were responsible for carrying out the deportation orders. Some legal experts have even suggested that Attorney General Pam Bondi could potentially be implicated because the Justice Department is responsible for defending these policies in court and would have been aware of the injunctions. If these officials are ultimately found in criminal contempt, they could face fines of thousands of dollars and potentially up to 6 months in jail, though judges typically reserve jail time for the most egregious cases of contempt. Even without jail time, having federal officials convicted of criminal contempt for defying court orders would be absolutely devastating to the administration's credibility and would set a precedent that executive branch officials can't just ignore judicial rulings they don't like. The ACLU and other civil rights organizations that brought the original challenges to these deportations have been extremely aggressive in pushing for contempt proceedings because they understand that if Trump officials can get away with ignoring court orders in this case, it sets a precedent that will encourage similar defiance in other cases. The ACLU has vowed to take this all the way to the Supreme Court if necessary to establish the principle that executive branch officials must comply with judicial orders, even when they believe those orders are wrong or harmful to national security. This is a critical fight over the fundamental question of whether we have rule of law in this country, or whether powerful officials can just do whatever they want as long as they claim they're protecting national security or following presidential directives. The August 2025 appeals court ruling that temporarily blocked the contempt proceedings was controversial from the moment it was issued because of both the reasoning used and the makeup of the judicial panel. The two judges who voted to block the proceedings, both Trump appointees, relied heavily on separation of powers concerns, arguing that criminal contempt proceedings against executive officials for carrying out presidential directives would create an untenable conflict between branches. But legal scholars quickly pointed out the flaws in this reasoning, noting that executive officials are still bound by law and by court orders, even when they're following presidential directives, and that allowing them to claim immunity from contempt just because they were doing what the president told them to do would completely undermine judicial authority. The dissenting judge on that panel made exactly this point in a scathing opinion, arguing that the majority was essentially giving the executive branch a free pass to ignore court orders as long as they could point to presidential authority. The fact that these contempt proceedings are being revived in November 2025 suggests a few possible developments. One possibility is that Judge Boasberg has documented additional violations that occurred after the appeals court's August ruling, showing a pattern of continued defiance that makes contempt proceedings even more necessary. Another possibility is that the appeals court has reconsidered its earlier ruling after seeing how the Trump administration has continued to push boundaries in other cases. A third possibility is that different judges are now involved and are taking a different view of the separation of powers issues. Regardless of which scenario is correct, the revival of these proceedings shows that the judicial system is not giving up on holding Trump officials accountable for defying court orders, and that judges are prepared to use their contempt powers as a last resort to maintain the authority of the courts. The deportations to El Salvador that are at the center of this case are themselves incredibly controversial and raise serious humanitarian concerns beyond just the legal questions about court orders. Reports from El Salvador describe overcrowded prisons with terrible conditions, lack of due process for people being held there, and allegations of abuse and mistreatment. The Venezuelan migrants who were sent there are being held indefinitely without any real opportunity to challenge their detention or seek asylum or other legal protections. Some of them have family members in the United States who are desperately trying to get them back but have no legal mechanism to do so because the deportations were carried out in defiance of court orders that should have protected their rights. This is exactly why courts issued injunctions in the first place. Because once people are deported to third countries where they have no legal status or protections, it becomes extremely difficult or impossible to undo the harm even if courts later rule that the deportations were illegal. The broader judicial pushback against Trump's policies that we're seeing across multiple issue areas shows that courts are increasingly willing to aggressively check executive overreach rather than deferring to presidential claims of authority. In addition to the deportation cases, judges have blocked or limited Trump's efforts to fire immigration judges en masse, his attempts to withhold federal funding from sanctuary cities, his efforts to end various refugee and asylum programs, and numerous other initiatives where judges found constitutional or statutory violations. This judicial resistance is coming from the district court level where cases are initially heard, from appeals courts where decisions are reviewed, and even from the Supreme Court in some instances where the administration has suffered unexpected defeats. The pattern is clear. The federal judiciary as an institution is not going to rubber stamp Trump's actions and is prepared to enforce legal limits on presidential power, even when that creates political controversy. The comparison to previous constitutional crises involving conflicts between the executive and judicial branches is instructive because it shows both how serious this situation is and what the potential outcomes might be. During the Watergate crisis, President Nixon refused to comply with court orders to turn over the White House tapes, claiming executive privilege and separation of powers. The Supreme Court unanimously ruled against Nixon and ordered him to turn over the tapes, and Nixon ultimately complied, even though those tapes contained evidence that led directly to his resignation. The key lesson from Watergate is that when push comes to shove, presidents are supposed to follow court orders even when those orders are politically devastating to them. Trump is testing whether that norm still holds, or whether a president who's willing to be aggressive enough can get away with defying judicial authority. The contempt proceedings are part of the judicial system's response to that test. Judges are saying we're prepared to impose real consequences on executive officials who defy our orders, and we're not going to let claims of presidential authority or national security override our constitutional role as a check on executive power. So what does all of this actually mean for Trump's presidency, for the effectiveness of his immigration policies, and for the broader constitutional order? Well, first and most obviously, having your top officials facing criminal contempt proceedings is a disaster for any administration because it creates enormous distraction and uncertainty about whether those officials can continue serving or whether they need to be replaced to avoid the political and legal fallout. If officials at DHS and ICE are convicted of criminal contempt and potentially face jail time or large fines, that sends a chilling message to other officials throughout the executive branch that defying court orders carries real personal consequences. This could make it much harder for Trump to find people willing to aggressively push the boundaries of executive authority because they'll be worried about their own legal exposure rather than just following orders from the White House. The impact on Trump's deportation agenda specifically is potentially devastating because if officials are found in contempt and courts start imposing penalties, that could effectively halt or severely limit the administration's ability to carry out mass deportations using the Alien Enemies Act. Even if the contempt proceedings don't result in criminal convictions, the legal uncertainty and the threat of contempt hanging over officials' heads is going to make them much more cautious about implementing aggressive deportation policies. This is exactly what judicial review is supposed to do. It's supposed to force the executive branch to operate within legal bounds and to respect court orders even when those orders interfere with policy goals. The fact that Trump's deportation agenda is being constrained in this way shows that the system of checks and balances is working even in the face of an administration that's trying to push past constitutional limits. The political implications for the 2026 midterms are complex because these judicial fights cut in different directions with different constituencies. For Trump's MAGA base, seeing their president blocked by judges and having his officials threatened with contempt is likely to generate anger at the judicial system and could potentially increase turnout among voters who see this as more evidence that the deep state and the establishment are trying to undermine Trump's agenda. These voters might rally around Trump and argue that he needs more power or fewer constraints so he can actually deliver on his promises. But for moderate and swing voters, the people who actually decide close elections, seeing Trump officials defying court orders and facing contempt proceedings is likely to reinforce concerns that this administration is lawless and out of control. These voters tend to value institutional stability and rule of law, and they're likely to view judicial pushback against Trump as a sign that checks and balances are working rather than as evidence of persecution. The leverage these judicial fights give Democrats heading into the midterms is substantial because Democrats can point to specific court rulings and contempt proceedings as evidence that Trump is violating the Constitution and that congressional oversight is desperately needed. When federal judges are finding probable cause that Trump officials committed crimes by defying court orders, that's not partisan spin. That's the judicial branch formally documenting misconduct. Democrats can run on a platform of restoring constitutional government and providing the congressional oversight that's needed to rein in an out-of-control executive branch. And they can point to these contempt cases as Exhibit A for why that oversight is necessary. The fact that some of the judges involved in these cases are Republican appointees, including some Trump appointees, makes it harder for Trump to claim this is just partisan persecution, which strengthens Democrats' messaging. The potential for these contempt proceedings to reach the Supreme Court is very real because the separation of powers issues involved are fundamental constitutional questions that the court might ultimately need to resolve. If lower courts convict Trump officials of contempt and impose penalties, the administration will almost certainly appeal all the way to the Supreme Court, arguing that the contempt proceedings interfere with the president's ability to execute the laws and to protect national security. The Supreme Court would then have to decide whether executive branch officials can be held in contempt for defying court orders when they claim they were following presidential directives, and whether national security justifications override judicial authority in immigration cases. This would be one of the most significant Supreme Court cases about executive power and separation of powers in decades, and the outcome could fundamentally reshape the balance of power between the branches for generations to come. The risk of a constitutional crisis escalating to the point where Trump simply refuses to comply with court orders or contempt rulings is real and terrifying because it would represent a complete breakdown of constitutional government. We've already seen Trump personally defying court orders in ways that have led to contempt threats. And we've now seen his administration officials defying injunctions in deportation cases. If this pattern continues and Trump decides he's just not going to follow adverse court rulings or allow his officials to be held accountable for contempt, then we're in uncharted territory where the rule of law has essentially collapsed. At that point, the only remedies would be impeachment by Congress, which requires political will that might not exist if Republicans maintain control, or enforcement of court orders through mechanisms like U.S. Marshals trying to arrest executive branch officials, which would create unprecedented and potentially violent confrontations between branches of government. The international implications of the United States descending into this kind of constitutional crisis over the executive branch defying judicial authority would be severe for American credibility and for global perceptions of democratic governance. The United States has long positioned itself as a model of constitutional democracy with strong institutions and rule of law, and American officials regularly lecture other countries about respecting judicial independence and following court rulings. When our own president and his officials are defying court orders and facing contempt proceedings as a result, that completely undermines American moral authority to promote democracy and rule of law abroad. Foreign leaders who are criticized by the U.S. for authoritarianism can point to Trump's contempt for judicial authority and say, "You're doing the same thing, so why should we listen to your lectures about democracy?" This erosion of American credibility has real consequences for our ability to lead democratic coalitions and to advance American interests through soft power and moral suasion. The impact on the broader rule of law culture in the United States is potentially devastating because once people see that powerful officials can defy court orders without facing meaningful consequences, that undermines respect for law generally and encourages other actors to ignore legal constraints when it's convenient for them. If the president and his top officials can ignore court orders by claiming national security or presidential authority, why should state and local officials follow federal court rulings they don't like? Why should businesses comply with regulatory orders they disagree with? Why should individuals respect judicial rulings in their cases? The entire legal system depends on a shared understanding that court orders must be followed even when people think those orders are wrong, and that if you disagree with a ruling, the proper response is to appeal it to higher courts rather than just ignoring it. Trump's contempt for judicial authority threatens to break down that shared understanding and to create a culture where everyone starts picking and choosing which laws and court orders they're going to follow based on their own preferences and power. The bottom line is this: federal judges going nuclear by reviving criminal contempt proceedings against Trump officials for defying deportation orders represents one of the most serious constitutional confrontations of Trump's presidency and signals that the judicial branch is prepared to aggressively defend its authority against executive branch overreach. These contempt proceedings carry the very real possibility of Trump officials being convicted of crimes and facing fines or even jail time, which would be unprecedented in modern American history and would send shockwaves through the administration. The revival of these proceedings in November 2025, after they were temporarily blocked, shows that judges are not backing down despite the separation of powers concerns raised by some Trump-appointed appeals court judges, and that the judicial system as a whole recognizes that allowing executive officials to ignore court orders would fundamentally undermine the rule of law. Combined with all the other ways judges are pushing back against Trump's agenda, blocking his policies, striking down unlawful appointments, threatening Trump himself with contempt for his courtroom behavior, this creates a picture of a judiciary that's united across partisan and ideological lines in defense of constitutional limits on presidential power. Whether this judicial resistance will ultimately succeed in constraining Trump, or whether we're heading toward a full constitutional crisis where the executive branch simply refuses to accept judicial authority, remains to be seen. But what's clear is that we're at a critical juncture where the separation of powers is being tested in ways we haven't seen since Watergate. The outcome of these contempt proceedings and the broader judicial pushback against Trump will determine whether America emerges from this period with its constitutional system intact, or whether we've fundamentally transformed into something more like an imperial presidency where the executive branch can do whatever it wants as long as it's willing to ignore courts and defy legal constraints. That's not hyperbole. That's the actual choice we're facing, and the judges who are reviving these contempt proceedings understand that they're fighting to preserve the constitutional order itself, not just to enforce their rulings in particular cases.